At 2:16 p.m. on January 11, 1945, a Zero came screaming out of the clouds, machine guns flashing. The gunners on the USS Lunga Point opened fire. Too late. The Zero dropped to 50 feet and aimed straight for the flight deck. But just before impact, a strange staccato burst from a .50 caliber gun atop a steel crate ripped the Zero to pieces mid-air. It tumbled into the sea, trailing smoke. That burst didn't come from the ship's AA guns. It came from an improvised gunnery nest, built out of scrap, spare parts, and stubbornness by Petty Officer Dorie Simmons, a black Navy mechanic the crew had mocked just weeks before. It was his 23rd confirmed kill. His crazy trick. A rewired gimbal, a hand-rigged elevation crank, and the belief that he wasn't going to die waiting for someone else to pull the trigger. In just 44 days, his contraption shot down 26 Japanese aircraft. The Navy never officially recognized it, but every sailor on that deck knew who saved them. Before we dive deeper into the story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from today? Dorie Simmons had neither rank nor recognition, just a mop and a job nobody wanted. Assigned to the Lunga Point in the fall of 1944, he wore the Navy blues, but the uniform didn't mean much below deck. For black sailors like Simmons, the war was fought behind brooms, not behind guns. He scrubbed floors, hauled trash, and mopped oil from the catwalks where white sailors passed without looking twice. There were unspoken rules in the Pacific Fleet, rules that said where a man could sleep, what he could touch, who he could talk to. And Simmons learned quickly that touching anything marked ordnance or gunnery would get you written up. Or worse. But while others stared at the ocean, Simmons stared at machinery. During those quiet hours when nobody paid attention to the man with the mop, he studied the gun mounts bolted to the railing, the way the Quad 50s arced and recoiled, the way the crew moved, fast but never fast enough. His hands would itch with the urge to adjust things he wasn't allowed to touch. Because, underneath the sweat-stained shirt and quiet demeanor, Dorie Simmons was a mechanic to his bones. Born in rural Alabama, the son of a sawmill foreman and a mother who fixed radios for the black church choir, Simmons had grown up with engine grease under his fingernails before he was 10. He rebuilt his first carburetor at 12, repaired farm tractors at 15, and by 17 could strip down a generator blindfolded. The Navy didn't ask about any of that when they drafted him. They saw his skin, not his hands. So they made him a messman and sent him to war with a mop. But a mechanic's brain doesn't turn off. Simmons noticed things, like how the gun crews struggled to aim high enough when Zeros came in steep. He saw the hesitation in their movements when switching targets, saw the slow traverse motors, the mechanical drag, the frozen second that made the difference between a clean kill and a flaming hole in the deck. He memorized their rotation limits, recoil delays, reload speeds. He watched every single gunnery drill like it was an open-book test. He never asked questions. Didn't have to. The machines told him everything. In the silence of routine, Simmons heard the ship whisper its weaknesses. And though he said nothing aloud, he catalogued every vulnerability like a blueprint in his head. The other sailors saw none of this. To them, he was just Dorie, the quiet black kid from below deck who kept the floor spotless and didn't talk back. But Simmons didn't need them to see. He had patience, and war was never short on opportunities. So when the first kamikaze came screaming down on the Lunga Point in late December, and the portside quad missed clean, Simmons didn't just feel the fear. He felt the flaw. Not in the gun, in the system. And in that moment, sweat mixing with steel dust, heartbeat pounding beneath regulation cotton, he made a quiet decision. If nobody was going to fix it, he would. Not for glory, not for permission, but because that's what a mechanic does. Fix what's broken. Even if the rules say you can't. Even if nobody ever notices. Because sooner or later, broken things kill people. And Simmons had already seen enough dying to last a lifetime. By January of 1945, dying had become routine in the waters off Luzon. It came screaming from the sky, trailing smoke and fury. Japanese Zeros piloted by young men who had no intention of coming home. Kamikaze wasn't a tactic anymore. It was a doctrine. Simmons first heard the word whispered in the mess line, carried like a rumor. But it stopped being abstract when the USS Amane Bay exploded 3 miles off their port side, sending fireballs into the sky and metal across the waves. He had been on cleaning duty when the first impact hit. Thought it was a depth charge until the second blast shook the Lunga Point and men started shouting about a burning carrier. The kamikaze hadn't missed. It had hit dead center, like it wanted to die and take everything with it. The Navy had no defense for that kind of madness. Traditional anti-aircraft guns could track bombers and fighters, but not a plane accelerating vertically into the deck at nearly 400 knots. There wasn't time to calculate trajectory. Simmons stood near the rear railing and watched the Amane Bay die. He saw sailors diving into flame-lit water, men leaping from a sinking deck, machine guns still chattering out of instinct, but too slow, too late. The fireball seared itself into his mind, and something inside him cracked. Not from fear, but fury. They weren't losing because they weren't brave. They were losing because they were slow. He turned toward the rear port gun mount and saw what he'd already suspected. The elevation arc didn't go high enough. The gunner had tried. He could see the melted barrel where the operator had fired straight into the belly of the kamikaze, but it hadn't mattered. The gun just didn't move fast enough. The attack on the Amane Bay wasn't the last. 3 days later, Simmons watched the USS Columbia take 2 direct hits in under 5 minutes. The Columbia survived, but barely. On the Lunga Point, they all waited their turn. That's how it felt. Not if, but when. The crew walked slower, smiled less. Simmons caught sight of young gunners shaking as they cleaned their belts, knowing full well that their weapon wasn't going to save them when the moment came. Simmons didn't sleep those nights. Instead, he paced the darkened catwalks, hands in his pockets, staring at the angles, the ranges, the dead zones in the gun arcs. He started sketching in a notebook he'd stolen from a supply locker, crude diagrams of gear ratios, crank assemblies, alternate mount positions. He thought about weight distribution, recoil absorption, sightline clearance. He remembered the crane winch in the maintenance bay. It could swivel on a gimbal and lift half a ton with inch-perfect control. Why couldn't a gun do the same? The night after the Columbia attack, a supply barge brought fresh ammunition and water to the Lunga Point. Simmons volunteered to help unload. Not because he wanted the work, because he knew the barge carried spare mechanical parts. Gears, crankshafts, torque rods, and something else. A rusting tripod meant for mounting a signal antenna. It looked like junk to the sailors. To Simmons, it looked like survival. He didn't say a word as he carried the tripod below deck, wrapped in canvas. That night, while the rest of the crew watched a John Wayne movie in the mess hall, Simmons sat cross-legged on the maintenance floor with a set of stolen tools, the tripod, and a half-disassembled gimbal joint. He wasn't building a miracle. He was building a chance. Because after watching 2 ships go down in flames, he understood something clearly. If he didn't change the way they fought, they were all going to die. Simmons didn't need a manual. What he needed was time, and no one watching. In the ship's lowest maintenance bay, tucked behind the backup generator and half concealed by a pile of oil drums, he laid out what the Navy would later insist never existed: a jury-rigged anti-aircraft gun mount, cobbled together from war scrap and desperation. The busted turret gave him the pivoting base. The crane assembly gave him the elevation crank. The gimbal let him swivel high and fast in any direction. He worked with the precision of someone who had rebuilt engines on dirt floors. 3 nights in a row, he stayed beneath the radar, literally and figuratively, sneaking meals, skipping sleep, cutting sheet metal with a dull hacksaw, while the rest of the crew drifted into restless war dreams. He mounted a single .50 caliber machine gun, standard issue, unmodified, onto the rig, elevated it with a 2-handed crank, and lined the base with rubber mats to absorb recoil. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't legal, but it moved faster than anything else on the deck, and it could point nearly straight up. That was the whole idea. The official AA mounts couldn't reach high enough, fast enough, at close range. Simmons's contraption could track a Zero from any dive angle and meet it head-on. He installed it at the stern, behind a stack of supply crates no one paid much attention to. No approval. No authorization. Just a crate, a crank, and a gun that could kill what the official ones missed. He didn't tell a soul. And then, on the second morning, the war came calling. A shrill cry of "Aircraft inbound!" snapped the crew from breakfast. Simmons had just stepped out of the maintenance bay, hands still covered in grease, when the siren screamed once, then cut off. A Zero was already visible over the water, hurtling in low, fast, nose dipped, glinting in the sun like a blade. The gun crews hadn't even reached their mounts. Simmons didn't think. He ran, past the crates, up the ladder, to the thing he had built with bloodshot eyes and blistered hands. He spun the crank. The barrel climbed, the gimbal turned, his boots skidded on the matting. The Zero filled his vision. His heart didn't pound. It froze. He squeezed the trigger, and the .50 cal roared to life. A full 5-second burst. The recoil slammed through the frame, but the mount held. The tracers stitched the air. 2 missed, the rest hit. The Zero folded inward like paper, spun, clipped the water, and erupted in a fireball 50 yards from the stern. Silence. Then, shouting. A dozen heads turned toward the aft rail. They'd seen it. Simmons stood behind the smoking barrel, shoulders heaving, the air thick with cordite. One of the deckhands dropped his coffee. A gunner's mate sprinted over and froze, staring at the mount like it was a ghost. "Where the hell did that come from?" someone yelled. Simmons didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. He'd built a gun that wasn't supposed to exist, and it had just done the impossible. Downed a kamikaze before the alarms had even finished sounding. The officers didn't know what to do. There was no protocol for rogue mechanics building kill-capable weapons. Some whispered court-martial, others promotion. But no one could deny what they'd seen. The Zero had been coming for them, low and fast, and Simmons shot it down. With a gun that shouldn't have been there. By the time Simmons was summoned to the captain's quarters, the entire crew had already heard about the kill. Some thought he'd be court-martialed, maybe even chained below deck. Unauthorized weapon construction during wartime? That wasn't a gray area. It was a firing squad offense on some ships. Simmons stood at attention, cover in hand, sweat running down his back, as Captain Roselli stared at him across the small, paper-cluttered desk. The captain didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds. Then he leaned forward and spoke 6 words that would change the course of Simmons's war. "Can you build another one?" No reprimand, no report, just an order dressed as a question. Simmons blinked once, then nodded. That was all the captain needed. Roselli didn't want paperwork. He wanted results. The Japanese weren't following Navy protocol, so maybe it was time someone on this ship didn't either. For the next 2 days, Simmons worked without rest. The maintenance crew didn't ask where he got the parts. Some looked the other way, others gave him tools without questions. He retrofitted a second mount on the starboard quarterdeck, this time with minor improvements: stronger elevation lock, faster crank rotation. Then he taught 3 sailors how to use it. One was a cook. One was a machinist's mate. The third was a medic who'd never fired a .50 before. Simmons drilled them with quiet intensity, focusing on muscle memory, target acquisition, elevation angles, lead timing. There was no manual, just instinct and repetition. None of it was official. The new mounts weren't on the ship's records. The men trained on them weren't logged as gunners. The ammo was borrowed, the time unpaid. But by the end of the week, Simmons's rigged stations accounted for 4 more confirmed kills. 4 kamikazes that never made it to the deck. The rest of the crew started calling it the Miracle Cradle, a nickname born from whispered conversations and disbelief. Nobody understood how it worked, but everyone knew it worked. The miracle wasn't the gun. It was that someone, a black mechanic with no rank and no clearance, had seen what was broken and fixed it. The shift in how the crew treated Simmons was slow, but unmistakable. Men who had once handed him dirty trays now offered him their extra rations. Gunners asked for his advice. Officers nodded at him in the corridor. The man who used to clean the mess hall was now the one who could keep them alive. Respect, in the Navy, usually wore medals or stripes. Simmons had neither. But he had numbers. He had kills. He had proof. And in a war where proof often came soaked in fuel and blood, that was enough. By the 10th day, word of the Miracle Cradle spread to the neighboring escort carrier, USS Nahenta Bay. Their XO sent a quiet inquiry. Nothing official. Just a question relayed through a mess cook. Could Simmons show them how it was done? The request never went up the chain. But 2 nights later, Simmons was quietly ferried over under the pretense of routine mechanical assistance. He didn't stay long, just enough to show one of their gunners how to adapt an old winch into a shoulder swivel mount. When he returned to the Lunga Point, no one said anything. They didn't have to. He wasn't just keeping his crew alive now. He was changing the way ships fought. 1 bolt, 1 crank, 1 zero at a time. And, for the first time since he boarded the Lunga Point, Simmons wasn't just seen, he was listened to. But being listened to wasn't the same as being accepted. As Simmons's untraceable kill count grew, so did the discomfort in the officers' wardroom. It wasn't the Miracle Cradle that rattled the Navy's bones. It was who had built it. A black mechanic, with no authorization, stepping outside the chain of command and receiving battlefield glory. That was a threat to more than just procedure. It challenged the very order the Navy had been built on. Behind closed hatches, whispers turned into warnings. One lieutenant from Ordnance threatened to file a formal report. Another accused Simmons of endangering the ship by tampering with munition systems. Simmons was pulled aside more than once and told to remember his place. But even as the warnings came down, the numbers kept going up. Over the next 6 weeks, Simmons's modified gun nests recorded 26 confirmed kills. Kamikazes came screaming through clouds, only to be ripped apart mid-dive, torn open by 50 caliber bursts from the back of the ship, fired by the man who was supposed to be cleaning grease traps. The radios lit up with awe and confusion. Pilots from overhead patrols began calling in over open channels. "That crazy gun's got another one." The phrase spread like wildfire. By the third week of February, Simmons wasn't just a mechanic. He was a rumor, a legend stitched together from steel, smoke, and defiance. Even Japanese intelligence took notice. Intercepted flight logs from Zero squadrons mentioned a rear-deck anti-air nest on an escort carrier near Luzon. Enemy pilots were ordered to avoid direct dives on that sector unless they had overwhelming numerical advantage. Some units changed their routes entirely. The Lunga Point's kill zone had become an invisible fortress, built not by brass, but by one man with a wrench and a vision. The shift in enemy behavior stunned analysts. Simmons didn't know about any of it. He didn't read decrypted dispatches or sit in intel briefings. He only saw what was in front of him: enemy planes and a crew that was still breathing. But others noticed. Some officers softened, others hardened. One tried to dismantle the cradle under the guise of safety inspections, but was talked down by the ship's XO. "That gun saved more lives than your clipboard," the XO reportedly said. The line never made it into official records. Neither did Simmons's name. None of the kills were logged under him. Not a single commendation was issued. But the crew knew. They kept their own tallies scratched into the underside of the gun mount. Little marks, one for each zero. When they reached 20, someone carved Dorie's wall above it in a rusted screwdriver tip. Simmons saw it once. He didn't say anything, just ran his hand across the metal and went back to work. Recognition in uniform didn't come from medals. It came from trust. And Simmons had earned something more powerful than paperwork. He had become essential. When storms scattered the radar or engines stalled, men didn't run to the bridge. They ran to Simmons. "What do we do?" they'd ask. He never shouted, never barked orders, just pointed, guided, fixed. He was the calm in chaos. Not because he had rank, but because he had answers. Yet even as his reputation grew, the tension never left. One misstep, one excuse, and everything he'd built could be stripped away. But Simmons didn't let it show. He didn't have time for politics. Zeros were still coming. Lives still hung on the spin of a crank and the aim of a barrel. So he kept going. One more bracket. One more round. One more shot fired from a gun that wasn't supposed to exist. By a man the Navy never meant to remember. On the morning of February 22nd, memory didn't matter. Survival did. At exactly 11:07 a.m., the sky above the Lunga Point cracked open. A lone Zero dropped from 3,000 feet, diving almost vertically with the sun at its back, using glare and gravity to blind every gunner on deck. The ship's radar had picked it up too late, and the alarms barely finished sounding when the kamikaze broke through the clouds. Its dive was erratic, zigzagging just enough to throw off the automatic targeting systems. The starboard batteries opened fire, missed. Port side quad 50s fired next. Missed again. Too slow. Too low. The Zero kept coming. That's when Simmons moved. Without waiting for an order, without even a shout, he leapt into the miracle cradle and started cranking the mount to 70 degrees. So steep the mechanism groaned under the strain. The Zero was less than 400 yards out. He spun the base with one hand and held the trigger with the other. He didn't aim with his eyes, he aimed with his gut. And as the Zero leveled off for its final strike, just seconds from slamming into the ship, Simmons fired. The mount bucked. The recoil nearly lifted him off the mat. But the tracers found their mark. The first burst clipped the wing. The second shattered the nose. The third ripped straight through the cockpit. The Zero detonated in midair, 40 feet above the deck, in a shockwave of fire and shrapnel. Debris rained down like burning confetti, pinging off steel, ricocheting into the sea. But no one died. Not one sailor lost. Simmons stood there, smoke still curling from the barrel, his face expressionless, chest heaving. And for a brief moment, the ship was silent. Then the cheering started. It began with one voice, then another. Then the entire flight deck roared with the kind of sound you only hear when men realize they've just cheated death. They swarmed him, lifted him up right there on the mount. For the first time, Simmons didn't fade into the background. He was the center of the ship. For 2 whole minutes, war paused. Cameras snapped. Someone even filmed it from the upper catwalk, a blurry, black-and-white reel that would later be lost in transit. But in that moment, the footage captured everything. A black sailor, cradled by his crew, standing beneath the drifting ashes of a kamikaze he had stopped cold. That celebration, as pure and earned as it was, marked the beginning of the end. By nightfall, the captain's mood had shifted. A junior officer had already submitted a report to Fleet Command. The ship's communication logs flagged the incident. Too many transmissions, too many questions, too much visibility. Command didn't like anomalies, it liked structure. The next morning, Simmons was called below for an informal debrief. He wasn't reprimanded, but he wasn't congratulated either. Just a series of pointed questions. How long had the mount been in use? Who helped him? Where did the materials come from? He answered truthfully. It didn't seem to matter. Within days, officers from Fleet Ordnance boarded the Lunga Point under the pretense of equipment inspection. Simmons wasn't allowed near the cradle during their visit. When he returned, the mount was untouched. But the mood had changed. Senior staff stopped making eye contact. His name stopped being mentioned in reports. And the footage? Vanished. Never sent up. Never logged. The Navy wasn't going to punish Simmons, but they weren't going to acknowledge him either. The miracle cradle had saved lives, but it had embarrassed the system. And in a war where appearance was everything, the man who built it was easier to erase than to reward. Simmons understood. He said nothing, just cleaned the barrel, oiled the crank, and waited for the next zero. The next zero never came. What arrived instead was an order, short, cold, typed in perfect alignment on government letterhead. It came down from Fleet Command 7 days after the mid-air explosion that had saved every life aboard the Lunga Point. The message was simple. Remove unauthorized weapon mount. Violation of equipment protocols. No explanation. No commendation. No thanks. Just bureaucracy, doing what bureaucracy always does. Restoring order to the edges of chaos. Captain Roselli read the order twice in silence, jaw locked, fingers tightening around the paper, until the corners creased. Then he called Simmons into his quarters and handed it to him without a word. Simmons scanned the single paragraph and understood everything before he even finished reading. They weren't just dismantling his gun, they were dismantling him. The brass couldn't afford an enlisted black mechanic rewriting the book on anti-aircraft warfare. It made the engineers look slow, the officers look blind, and the system look fallible. The Navy couldn't allow that, not in wartime, not ever. So, the miracle had to vanish. The captain didn't look at him when he spoke, just said quietly, "You'll have to take it down yourself, Simmons. That's an order." It was the first time the captain's voice didn't carry weight. It carried regret. Simmons nodded once. "Aye, sir," he said, and walked out without another word. When the news spread through the ship, the reaction was immediate. The same sailors who'd once ignored him, who now saluted him in the corridors, erupted in disbelief. The cook slammed a pot onto the galley counter hard enough to dent it. A gunner's mate refused to eat. Even the XO tried to appeal the decision through a coded message to Fleet Logistics, but the reply came back fast. Compliance mandatory. No one dared push further. You didn't argue with the chain of command, not if you wanted to keep your ship, your job, or your life. The following morning, the entire deck went silent as Simmons walked toward the stern. The sun had barely risen. The sky streaked pink over the Pacific. He carried a wrench in one hand, a rag in the other. Men lined the railings, pretending to clean, pretending not to watch. He climbed onto the mount and ran his hand across the cold metal one last time. Then he began to unbolt it, one piece at a time. No ceremony, no anger, just quiet precision. The same steady rhythm with which he'd built it. Every turn of the wrench echoed like a funeral bell. When he removed the last bolt, the mount sagged, then folded, its pieces clattering to the deck. The smell of oil and salt filled the air. Simmons wiped his hands, stacked the parts neatly beside the crate, and stepped back. Not one word was spoken. The ship's log recorded nothing that day. No drills, no incidents, no mention of dismantled equipment. But the men who saw it never forgot. They said his expression wasn't one of defeat, but of something harder to name. Not pride, not sorrow, just clarity. A man who knew that sometimes silence is the only weapon left. That night, the crew gathered in the mess without orders. No music, no drink. Just a shared understanding that something sacred had been taken from them. Simmons didn't attend. He stayed below deck, sitting by the stripped gimbal and the pile of metal that had once defied death. He didn't curse the Navy. He didn't rage against the injustice. He just sat there, staring at his reflection in the steel, and whispered the same words he'd said when he first built it. If it saves one more man, it was worth it. Then he turned off the light, and the Lunga Point sailed into the dark, her decks quiet, her miracle undone, but never forgotten. Decades passed. The war ended. Ships were scrapped, uniforms folded into cedar chests, and medals pinned to the chests of men whose names filled history books. But Dorie Simmons's name wasn't in any of them. Not in the Navy cross lists. Not in the official action reports. Not in the archives of innovation. His mount, his kills, his miracle. It all vanished beneath layers of red tape and silence. The paper trail ended where the order to dismantle began. For years, Simmons lived like the rest of the forgotten. He went home, started a quiet life in Alabama, opened a garage, and fixed engines for farmers who never knew he'd once fought off kamikazes with a machine built from junk. He never talked about it, never bragged, never asked for recognition. But memory has a way of surviving, even when the paper doesn't. In the early 1980s, a Navy historian named Charles Redman began researching Pacific escort carriers for a book on underdocumented engagements. He wasn't looking for Simmons. He was looking for patterns. What he found instead was a mystery. A cluster of 26 unclaimed aerial kills, all dated between late January and early March of 1945. All logged under rear quadrant fire from the USS Lunga Point. No gunner names, no weapon designations, just confirmed kills with no clear source. That anomaly led Redman deeper into the archives. He began cross-referencing letters, journals, after-action notes, anything not marked classified. Again and again, one name slipped through the cracks, never formally, always in the margins. Dorie shot that one. The Cradle got another. Ask Simmons what he did. Redman was no fool. He knew when the official story didn't line up with the truth. He filed FOIA requests, tracked down surviving crewmen, and eventually boarded a plane to Alabama. By the time he found Simmons, The man was in his 60s, still working in his garage. The same hands that had spun a miracle, now grease-stained from brake pads and alternators. Redmond introduced himself, laid out what he knew, then waited. Simmons wiped his hands, sat down on a work stool, and said 7 words. "You really want to know the truth?" For the next 2 hours, he told Redmond everything. The gun, the crank, the zero, the order to take it down, the silence that followed. Redmond took notes until his hand cramped. But when he asked Simmons if he'd ever tried to challenge the Navy's decision, Simmons just smiled and said, "Wouldn't have mattered." The historian didn't stop there. He interviewed other survivors, men who confirmed every detail. One had kept a scrap of the original mount. Another had photographs, undeveloped for 40 years, showing Simmons crouched behind the miracle cradle, jaw clenched, eyes fixed skyward. It was all real, all of it, and none of it in the official record. Redmond submitted a full report to the Naval Historical Center in 1986. They acknowledged receipt, but no action was taken. No medal, no amendment, no press release. Just another file, marked and shelved. Simmons remained a ghost in Navy history. The man who turned scrap into salvation, erased by the very system he had saved. But ghosts don't fade when people remember. And now, with every retelling, every sailor's journal, every descendant who hears the story, passed down through whispered pride, Dorie Simmons lives on. Not in the halls of the Pentagon, but in the hearts of those who knew what he did. In the memory of a ship that would have burned without him. In the blank spaces between the lines of the official record, spaces filled now, at last, with truth. After the war, Dorie Simmons went home to Alabama. The Navy let him go quietly, without ceremony, without thanks, without the faintest trace of the man he'd been out there on the deck of the Lunga Point. He stepped off the train in Montgomery, wearing a uniform that still smelled faintly of gunpowder and sea salt. His mother met him at the station. She hugged him once, tight, then asked what he'd done in the war. He just said, "Fixed things." That was the last time he ever talked about it. He opened a small repair shop off a dirt road that curved between cotton fields and gravel lots. He called it Simmons Motor and Machine, though most of the letters on the sign eventually rusted away until it just read Simmons. People brought him tractors, radios, truck engines, whatever they could drag through the door, and he fixed them all. Quietly. Thoroughly. The way he'd always done things. His neighbors thought he was just another veteran who came home and stayed home. He never joined a Legion Hall, never marched in parades, never hung flags on his porch. His war lived inside him, folded neatly between the gears and grease of everyday work. But some memories don't fade with silence. Every February, without fail, an envelope would arrive. No return address, no handwriting on the front except his name and his town. Inside was a single card, always the same. Plain white, thick paper, with one number written in blue ink, 26. No message, no signature, just the number. The first time it came, in 1946, he stared at it for a long while before setting it on his workbench. The next year, another arrived. Then another. He never told anyone about them. Never asked who sent them, but he didn't have to. He knew. They were from the men who had been on that deck, the ones who lived because of him, because of the gun that wasn't supposed to exist. Some had gone on to fly again, others to raise families, some to lose themselves in bars and battles of their own. But once a year, they remembered. And every year, they let him know in the only way the Navy hadn't forbidden, with a number. Each card was a silent salute, a heartbeat of loyalty that crossed time and distance. Simmons kept every single one. He stored them in a drawer beside his discharge papers, folded in the same creases they'd been mailed with. That drawer became a kind of private memorial, a small museum of lives spared. When the world outside got loud, wars in Korea, in Vietnam, new generations of uniforms and forgotten names, he'd sometimes open that drawer and look at the stack. 26 white cards, 26 ghosts, 26 reasons he didn't need a medal. On Sundays, when the shop was closed, he'd sit on the porch and watch the horizon the way he used to watch the ocean. His wife, if she asked about the war, got the same answer as his mother had. Fixed things. He never mentioned the miracle cradle, never spoke the word kamikaze again. Yet the weight of those cards, light as paper, heavy as history, kept him tethered to the men who knew the truth. When he grew older, slower, his hands began to shake too much for fine work. But he still oiled his tools, lined them up on the bench, and dusted that drawer every February. Because some promises, like some inventions, never die. They just wait in the shadows, quiet, steady, eternal, like the man who made them. Today, there's no plaque for Dorie Simmons, no Navy Cross on display, no ceremony with brass buttons and folded flags. In the official records of the Pacific Theater, his name doesn't appear beside any confirmed kills. The miracle cradle isn't diagrammed in any museum. No mention in textbooks, no feature in documentaries. And yet, among the men who were there, who lived through the suicide skies over Luzon, his name travels like smoke through memory. You won't find it in press clippings or award citations, but say, Dorie, to a graying sailor who once walked the deck of the Lunga Point, and you'll see something shift in his eyes. Because they remember. Not the paperwork, not the politics, but the sound, that burst, when the zero exploded in the sky, and they realized they were still alive. They remember the man who made that moment possible with bolts, steel, and belief. The reason there's no official honor for Simmons has little to do with oversight and everything to do with discomfort. The Navy had built its order on hierarchy, and Simmons stepped outside it. He broke regulations not to challenge authority, but to save lives. That distinction made all the difference to the men beside him, but none to the bureaucracy above. A black mechanic, in a segregated service, creating a weapon from scrap and outperforming sanctioned systems? That was a narrative too dangerous to elevate, because it meant admitting the system had failed, and he had not. Still, the truth outlived the silence. Simmons changed how kamikaze defense was seen across the fleet. After the war, weapon mount flexibility became a standard for close-quarters anti-aircraft design. Ships received rotating, manually operated mounts in sectors previously deemed inaccessible. Officially, these were attributed to engineering reviews and post-action reports. Unofficially, they came from watching what happened when a man with no permission did what had to be done. Simmons never claimed credit, but the men who learned from him, those who trained under his quiet hand, those who survived because he cranked that gun faster than thought, knew exactly where the change began. He didn't wear innovation like a badge. He was innovation, practical, invisible, and desperately human. What Simmons did wasn't glamorous. It didn't happen in a lab or behind a podium. It happened in the heat, in the dark, between cleaning shifts and alarms. Surrounded by doubt, fear, and death. That's the kind of heroism history often misses. Not the loud, shining kind, but the kind built from scraped knuckles, bent metal, and a refusal to wait for permission. He didn't fight for medals. He fought for the man next to him. And when he dismantled the gun, he didn't cry. He built it again, if only in memory, every time a white envelope arrived with the number 26. That number meant something. It wasn't just a tally. It was a declaration. You mattered. Today, we tell his story not because it's easy, but because it's right. Because every name etched into stone stands on the shoulders of 100 that were never carved. Because war isn't won by headlines, it's won by mechanics with vision, cooks who pick up rifles, medics who refuse to give up. Dorie Simmons was never supposed to be remembered, and yet, here we are, remembering. That is the quiet victory. That is the lasting truth. And that is how one gun that never officially existed ended up saving everyone. If that moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor. Tell someone. Speak his name. Share his story. Because Dorie Simmons doesn't need a plaque to be remembered. He just needs you.